Held Australian Professor of Armenian Studies at Cal State Fresno. As most of you know, I run the Armenian Studies Fresno, very good place to be doing. Prior to that, he was a lecturer in Armenian and Religious Studies at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. His doctorate was conferred by Harvard University with honors in Near Eastern languages and civilizations. And I urge you to pay very close attention to what he is about to tell you about the Armenian genocide.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Diane. Thank you for Sonoma State for having me again. Hopefully, this will not be a repeat for many of you here. I'd also like to thank the Alliance and Christine Davidian for arranging this. It's a pleasure, as always, to come here on this distressing topic, but I always get a lot out of it myself in the questions and answer period, as well as the discussions that I have with friends and colleagues after this many years. So we stand here in 2015, a century after the beginning of the Armenian genocide. I know many people, many friends and relatives of mine who are Armenian, can't believe this year has actually come, because it's been so long that people have been talking about the issues that I will be discussing today. And to note or to realize that we've hit 100 years and that for the most part, all of the survivors have now passed as well. There are some from the end of the genocide who were very, very young, who are still alive. But most people who survived who were of cognizant age, who were 8, would be 108 today or 100 today. And so, you know, the realization of 100 years, on the one hand, there's a great amount of satisfaction knowing that the Armenian community has survived 100 years after these events took place, that they've grown, that they've become stronger, that they've continued to contribute to whatever society that they're in. But also, there is a sense of sadness, the sense of a passing of a generation, and a fear that with the passing of that generation, with the passing of the people who had that firsthand experience, that what happened to them will also pass with them. So one of the, I would say, aspects of 2015 has been to try and make sure that that does not happen. Today, I'd like to focus on several sort of topics surrounding the Armenian genocide as well as the genocide itself. Sort of, I don't know how many people here are familiar with Armenia or Armenians, so I do want to talk about, you know, where Armenia is, give you a basic introduction, who the Armenians were and are. I'd also get into the historical aspect of what was the genocide, how did it happen, and what were the results. But also, what does it have to do with us? One question I've heard a lot from people is that it was 100 years ago, who cares? A lot of things happened 100 years ago. And in reality, what I'd like to present today is that it has everything to do with the world we live in. And it actually provides me and you and the generations to come a challenge about how we live in the world that has been bequeathed to us. And so finally, I'd like to look at also what we are doing today in terms of both in commemoration of 2015, the centenary, as well as what are we trying to do for the future. Okay, so let's start with the Armenia, where it is. Okay, oh, sorry. Basic facts first so that you guys, just as a baseline, so we know what's going on here. April 24th, 1915 is considered, is recognized as the beginning, the start date of the Armenian genocide. It was at that point that about 250 Armenian political leaders and intellectuals were arrested and were soon murdered. And between 1915 and 1923, approximately 1.5 million Armenians were killed, 800,000 in the first 4 months alone. So it's something I will return to later, but the majority of the killing took place within the first year of the genocide of 1915, 1916. And occurred in the Ottoman Empire, right, under the direction of the ruling Committee of Union and Progress, otherwise known as the CUP. That was the ruling party. I'll get into this a little bit later. And finally, or two more things, it's denied to this day, something else I'll be talking about. But one thing that I'd like to emphasize is that although this is a defining moment of Armenian history, it's not the defining. I repeat this every year. It's not the defining moment. Okay? Armenians have had a long history before this. They will have a long history after it. All right, so we need to recognize its pivotal role, not just for Armenians, but for all of humanity in the 20th century. But we also have to realize that this is not the end of the Armenian people by any stretch of the imagination, nor is it the only thing that they have achieved in their entire existence. Okay, so where is Armenia? You can sort of see it here. I don't know if there's a pointer on this. No, but this is, here is the Republic of Armenia today. This is a map of the former Soviet socialist republics in Central Asia and the Caucasus. And you can see the Republic of Armenia is quite tiny. It's sitting there in the Caucasus. If we look more, take a zoom in of it, this is what it looks like. It's bordered by Georgia to the north, Turkey to the west, Iran and Azerbaijan to the east and south. It's a very difficult neighborhood to live in, as you probably know. Next to it is the Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh. I'll mention this a little bit later on as well. That is a republic that declared its own independence, which nobody in the world recognizes other than itself, not even the Republic of Armenia. But it is an enclave of Armenians who were included within the Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan as an autonomous region. And then after the breakup of the Soviet Union, they've been fighting a war for independence from the Republic of Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan claims the land for itself. It's still considered one of the hot spots in the world today that could escalate to a rather nasty conflict. So I will be returning briefly later on to talk about that as well, but just so that we have an idea of where these places are. So you can see the Republic of Armenia is quite small, and it's about 1/10 the historical size, or 1/10 the size of the historical, what we call historical Armenia, or the area of land in which Armenians lived and were the dominant culture. I'll be showing that a little bit later. Or even if we want to look at, this is what we call the Armenian provinces. There were 6 Armenian provinces in the Ottoman Empire. You can see they took up what today is most of eastern Anatolia, eastern Turkey, and then they also went over into what was then part of the Russian Empire and includes today parts of the Republic of Armenia, parts of Azerbaijan, right? And we can see the Persian Empire just to the south there. So that is basically what we're talking about. When we're talking about the Armenian genocide, it occurred primarily in these areas in green, although by the time of the genocide, there were also Armenians throughout what today is the Republic of Turkey, Constantinople and other cities where the genocide also occurred. But the area of historical, let's say cultural dominance of the Armenians is pretty much what we see here with the 6 Armenian provinces of the Ottoman Empire. Okay, I also want to talk about some significant factors in Armenian self-identity rather quickly. How does an Armenian identify themselves? One, they have a very keen sense of their history, which is long. Okay, I'll talk about it. For example, there's a saint, I'll talk about this in a second, the Armenian church, Saint Vartan, who died in a battle 1,600 years ago. His saint day is coming up. I think it's February 12th this year, and Saint Vartan. Okay, that's 1,600 years, right, that they've been commemorating this. And they still do it. Little school kids do it. Right? They have a sense that they've been around a long time. Right? They know they're one of the old peoples of the near Middle East. They're also very proud of their Christian faith, which they adopted early. Right? In the 4th century, the king of Armenia accepted Christianity not only as his personal religion, but also made it the religion of his state, right, of his kingdom. And therefore, they became what is known as the first Christian nation. They have their own church. That is, it's called the Armenian Apostolic Church, which has its own head. It's called the Catholicos. So they have their own independent church, although they are in conversation and communion with other churches. And there are Armenians who belong to other churches. So we have Armenians who are Roman Catholics, and we have Armenians who are Protestants, as well as evangelicals. But the majority of Armenians remain Armenian Apostolic to this day. And they have their own language, which they have preserved, and their own alphabet, which was invented in 406 by a saint in the church, Saint Mesrop Mashtots. And there's been a continuous literature in Armenian from that time to the present. They still use that alphabet to this day. It has 36 letters, and they added 2 in the Middle Ages, so they're now 38 letters, and they have an uppercase and a lowercase. So it's a complete system within which they're able to express themselves. So I think these are some of the main points in which Armenians identify themselves by: their language, their faith, their history, and also the fact that they have a homeland, yes, and a dispersion. Throughout, I mean, given their long history, Armenians have always been around the world. They traveled for various reasons, whether it was because of political reasons, or whether they were part of foreign armies, or whether they were just trading on business, or whether they were just interested. But there's always been an Armenian dispersion, by which I mean that they've lived all over the place, not just in the homeland that we identified. As we'll see, one of the results of the genocide was also the creation of a diaspora, that is, the removal of the homeland and the creation of a community that lives almost entirely outside of the homeland. All right, so this sort of dichotomy between having homeland and having a dispersion is one that they've also known for a very long time, and it's part of their consciousness to this day. So I would say these are some of the self-identifying markers. If you asked an Armenian who they were, these would be some of the points that they would mention that would distinguish them from other peoples. Okay. So now let's look at Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. Right? The Ottoman Empire took what we considered the Armenian Plateau, or Armenia, however you want to call it, early in the 16th century. All right? And that's what we call it Western Armenia sometimes. It's the line between Armenia in the Ottoman Empire and Armenia in Iran and later Russia. We call Western Armenia that part that was in the Ottoman Empire. So the Ottomans take it early in the 16th century, and following upon that, there were a bunch of wars between the Ottomans and the rulers of Iran, the Safavids, that really had an adverse effect on Armenia. As you can see, it's right smack in the middle of these two empires and was often the battlefield. And this was one of the reasons why Armenians started going all over the region and all over the empire itself, and a significant amount of them also moved to Constantinople, to the capital, today's Istanbul, where they started to form quite a large part of the population, and they became quite affluent there as well, as we'll see. All right, so, but this goes back to pretty much this period, as I say here. Let's see what happened. Okay, okay, all right. Many Armenians moved to Constantinople. Let's see if we can keep. Okay, so let's look then, right, given this history, let's look at what it might have been like for an urban, relatively affluent Armenian in the middle of the 19th century, right? Primarily one that's possibly living in Constantinople. So an Armenian in Constantinople, let's say around in 1860. Right? And I think this background is important to understand, because I think one of the questions people have when they read about genocide is, why didn't you do anything? Like, why didn't you leave before? Right? How did you not see it coming? In hindsight, you don't throw a pass on second down into the end zone, right? Across the middle. But when you're sitting there with 30 seconds left and you have to make the call, it's a little bit more difficult. All right, so I mean, this is the question that people have, and one of the reasons that one of the aspects of this that I like to look at is, what was it like to be Armenian in the second half of the 19th century in the Ottoman Empire? First of all, this time is a time of great hope, right? It's excitement for everybody, time of change as well. A combination of internal and external political pressures had forced the Ottoman Empire and the sultans to issue a series of reforms, collectively known as Tanzimat. Right? And these reforms were meant to improve life in the empire, increase education, increase trade, protect the life and property of all the subjects of the empire, regardless of their faith. Right? And this was seen as really a progressive moment in the Ottoman Empire, where it was moving possibly towards some sort of constitutional sultanate, let's say the constitutional monarchies of Europe, but at least at a place in which Muslims, Christians, Jews, Greeks, Armenians, Turks, Kurds would all feel as citizens of the empire and on an equal footing. Right? And we have to note that, and I want to emphasize this as well, that the Ottoman Empire was really diverse, incredibly diverse. It wasn't just Turks and Kurds. and Armenians. There were also Greeks, and as I said, Jews. And then there were people from all over Europe, Italians, Italian traders who had been there, their families had been there since the 15th century, right? You have all different types of faiths, different types of Islam, different types of Christianity, right? Non-Judeo-Christian faiths as well. So, I mean, it was an incredibly vibrant, multilingual, multi-ethnic, multi-religious society, and one in which that had a fairly high standard of living for the time. Here we can see the Armenians, especially in these urban centers, did rather well. This is a picture of one of the famous hotels that Armenians own. You know they're Armenian, Tokatlian by the last name, that you know it's an Armenian who owned the hotel. All right, and this featured in Agatha Christie's Murder on the Orient Express. And here's a picture of it from around 1900. But a wealthy and middle class amongst Armenians had emerged by this time, by 1860. You have a sort of bourgeois society. You have older people who had made older families that had made a lot of money. But then you had newer families that had come in and made it through banking as well. They started playing important roles as moneylenders. They also took important positions in the Ottoman government. They controlled the mint. They controlled the gunpowder mills. They controlled the paper factories. They were also the imperial architects. Now, granted, some of the reasons why you wanted to appoint Armenians to these positions were because they didn't pose a threat. Right? They weren't going to overthrow the government. They weren't going to overthrow the Sultan, you know, even being given this power. Right? You wouldn't want to do that to the majority population, or let's say to the elite, the Turco-Muslim elite, that may actually threaten your power. But nonetheless, it means that there was a large amount of faith put into the Armenian community, a large amount of trust there. Right? And they were seen as competent and loyal subjects of the empire. As I say, they opened and also opened factories, gunpowder mills, and paper mills. So sensitive sectors of the Ottoman economy, Armenians had a large role in. Education. They also were highly educated comparatively at this time. First of all, wealthy Armenians went to Europe and studied there beginning in the 1840s. So they would go to Europe, be educated in European universities and schools, and then return to the Ottoman Empire sometimes and bring that knowledge with them. Missionaries from the United States, in particular, started opening up schools in the Ottoman Empire. Now, here, Muslims were not allowed to go to these Christian schools. Right? So the Armenians had a sort of advantage in being Christian, that they were able to, their own faith allowed them to go to these schools. They flocked to them in the cities and in the provinces. So this is a picture actually from outside of Istanbul, Constantinople, of Roberts College. But there were also other ones, such as Euphrates College and Anatolia College in Marzavan. And you know, they had a mixture of religious and secular education, but this meant that literacy amongst Armenians was rather high. And even more importantly, particularly after the genocide, women were educated by these missionaries. And that meant once that there was no male class, the women who came over after the genocide, who survived, brought with them a tradition of educating their young, or of being educated, and put a high priority on education. But many of these women went on to be the first. I know someone in my wife's family was in the first class at Harvard that admitted women at Radcliffe, right? And others I know were the first female book review editor of the New York Times Review of Books, right? So we can see that this was brought over, you know, from the Ottoman Empire to America, right? It's not, obviously it was the American opportunities that allowed it to happen, but still they brought that ideology of educating your children with them. We also have to look at Armenian culture at this time was incredibly vibrant. It was an exciting time, as I mentioned. We see the burgeoning of newspapers, literary journals, right? Literature. Armenians, until about this period, this is now known as the Zartonk, or the Renaissance, literally the reawakening, or the awakening of the Armenian people. Until this time, most of the literature and culture was done in the equivalent of their Latin in classical Armenian. And now, all of a sudden, people said, no, we're going to write in our own spoken language. And it was a very exciting thing, as people wrote back and forth. They argued over what the language should look like. They wrote tons of stuff. They translated things. And these translation movements were actually quite impressive, because they first did all the translation into the classical language, into the frozen form, and then realized that, whoops, nobody's going to read that anymore. We have to retranslate it into the modern language. So many of these things were done twice. But I mean, Homer, Virgil, Rousseau, Victor Hugo, French literature in particular was attractive to Armenians, and they translated, thousands of works in a relatively short period of time. So it was an incredibly, as I said, vibrant time. The first Armenian theater opened in 1861, and the Armenians even wrote their own constitution for internal purposes, not for the Ottoman Empire, but just for the governing of their own community, right, in 1863. So we have a sense of a community that's wealthy, right, relatively so, relatively well educated, culturally alive, in communication, both with other members of the Ottoman Empire, that is the other, whether they be Greeks or Jews or Turks, right, as well as with people outside of the empire, right? They're in conversation with what's going on in Europe. They're in conversation of what's going on in Russia in particular. They're also in conversation somewhat to what's going on in Iran. Right? So we have a very culturally connected, right, and intellectually stimulated community, right? And that has now the capital to back that up. So the question is, how do we go from here? Say an Armenian family at the 19th century, right, would be recognizable to anybody in England or France at that time or America, right, to here. Within a span of just a couple of decades. This is a vexing problem. Armenians are not the only one to have this problem, because the same thing, I mean, I know many Jewish people who felt the same thing. How did we go from being such a member of German society, completely feeling comfortable, having respected positions, to being considered outcasts worthy of extermination? Right? So let's look at some of the issues involved here in the Armenian case. First of all, what I was describing was an urban phenomenon. Right? In the Armenian provinces, the situation wasn't quite as good. Right? There, the mass of Armenians were still agricultural peasants. Right? They weren't necessarily well educated. They weren't necessarily wealthy. They weren't necessarily in communication with other people. That was one certain sector of the population. And there was a giant disconnect between those two populations. And not just amongst the Armenians, I would say for everybody in the empire. Right? Likewise, the reforms that helped the Armenians, particularly in the western part of the Ottoman Empire, the western part of Anatolia, around the capital, those reforms were not necessarily implemented in the provinces. Or if they were implemented, they weren't enforced. That is, it's great that you say that, their property has to be protected. But if no one's going to do the protecting, it's worthless, right? It's worthless as a law. So that was another problem. And we get it from all members of Ottoman society, not just the Armenians, but the Armenians in particular are saying, there is no law being enforced out here. Please go back. They would tell members of the Armenian church who sometimes went out to visit, go back to the patriarch in Constantinople and have him talk to the capital, to the government, and get some sort of law and order out here. We're still basically facing a situation like the Wild West, right? Where people raid our cattle, where they take our homes, where they steal from us randomly, and no one is doing anything. And in addition, we have a population problem. The Armenians are only an absolute majority in the province of Van, which is over here, right? And in most others, there are a plurality. That is, okay, if you take all of they may be 35%, but it's still 25% other, 25, 15 of other communities. And in some of these, they are a minority of the population, right? So we start to get tensions, ethnic and religious, ethno-religious tensions between the communities, particularly over resources. And this is part of the problem. It's exacerbated by the fact that many Muslims from Europe, right, are fleeing Europe as the Ottoman Empire, as we'll see, starts to recede, particularly from Europe and from the Black Sea. The Muslims who were there, whether they were in the Balkan Peninsula or whether they were in the Caucasus, start to come to the Ottoman Empire saying, look, we were your subjects, protect us. And they need a place to put them. So they tend to put them out here, right, trying to kill two birds with one stone. They're finding places for these people to live, and they think they can weaken the number of Armenians who were there. But this sort of population a sort of resettlement program does exacerbate tensions and creates, in many areas, fights over local, natural resources, food and water, basic parts of life. So that exacerbates the situation. There are other signs of trouble as well. As I said, that there are a series of military defeats for the Ottoman Empire in the 18th and 19th century. This makes them rather nervous about the situation. They feel less secure about their political future. The Russian Empire is expanding to the north, putting pressure on them. And the Russians themselves are claiming the Christian communities of the Ottoman Empire as their sort of protectorate, which obviously makes the Ottoman Empire suspect them a little bit. In the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 to 78, the Ottoman Empire was completely humiliated. They had problems competing in an international economy, having to take loans from Europe, and with that money, just let's say, for example, in Greece today, Europe tried to exert a measure of control over the Ottoman economy and Ottoman policy. All right, so we see these a series of events that lead to a sort of weakening of Ottoman morale. And the reforms were perceived as helping the minorities. Right? And this often created a backlash, particularly by provincial Muslims. That is, they didn't see a balancing out of, let's say, rights through the Ottoman Empire. That is, that everybody was receiving now the same rights. Rather, what they saw was a reduction of their own status, which used to be privileged, and now it was being brought down to being equal. And so this, in many areas, right, by many people, was not appreciated. And so they felt that they were being harmed and that they had to strike back and to protect their privileged positions. So these are some of the reasons that we see that there's still lingering problems despite what's going on in the cities and despite the reform movement. And in particular, Sultan Abdul Hamid II, who psychologically seems also to have been a bit unstable and paranoid, starts to blame or starts to develop anti-Armenian and in general anti-Christian views of the minorities of the Ottoman Empire, but particularly anti-Armenian, because he blames them for, in particular, for the loss of the 1877-78 Russo-Turkish War, because there were Russian generals who were Armenian. And so he starts to think of the Armenians, who were once considered the most trusted part of the Ottoman Empire, as a potential fifth column that will side with the Russians. Right? And so in 1895-96, again, trying to teach here the Armenians a lesson, he launched a series of massacres in which between 100,000 and 200,000 Armenians were killed. That figure does not go into the 1.5 million calculation for the genocide, as it happened 20 years earlier. One of the results of this was the tens of thousands of Armenians fled, and they served as the beginnings, the sort of seeds of the Armenian communities of those people who managed to survive the Armenian genocide later on. So as much as they didn't realize it then, those people who left in 1895-96, actually, particularly when they came to America, because it was so hard to get back from here, that's the reason why they and their families survived. If they had remained in the Ottoman Empire or gone back, they probably would have been killed. So what turned at first as a curse turned out to be a blessing later on. Now, I have to say, Sultan Abdul Hamid became actually intolerable to everybody. Even members of his own family thought he was nuts and wanted a different way of doing things. Not only Armenians, but other members of the Ottoman Empire, including Turks and Arabs, had enough of this sort of a absolute monarchy and wanted to move towards a constitutional form of government. And in 1908, there was a coup, and Sultan Abdul Hamid II was overthrown. The Young Turk Constitutional Government was set up, in which Armenians participated. They now form part of the government. Again, this was a great time of hope, and many Armenians actually came back. Those who were particularly in Europe decided to come back to help build what they thought was the new Ottoman Empire. All right, these were people who still felt themselves to be Ottoman as much as they did Armenian. And they felt that this was a great time for them to be able to come back and help build anew. However, there were still problems lurking. In particular, the military nationalists known as the Committee of Union and Progress, or the CUP, remained dissatisfied. There used to be a saying, or there was a saying of, Turkey for Turks. in the sense that if you're a Turkish citizen, you're proud to be, you want to defend Turkey. They decided to interpret that as Turkey for Turks, meaning if you're ethnically Turkish, you're the only people who should be in Turkey. And they also developed what we call a pan-Turkic ideology, where they wanted to stretch not only from the Mediterranean Sea all the way to the Pacific, linking all the Turkic peoples in between. Right? And the Armenians were in the way. But this was one of their overarching ideals, was to create this vast Turkic empire, right? If they can get rid of the peoples who weren't Turkic in between. And this was led, the ideologue for this was known as Ziya Gökalp, but the people who actually took power were the CUP. In 1913, further dissatisfied by other military losses by the government, they decided to launch a coup. They shot a couple of cabinet ministers, and they took over power. And there were three main architects of the CUP government and of the genocide. And these were Enver, who was the Minister of War, Talat, who was the Minister of the Interior, and Cemal, the Minister of the Navy. Now, Talat Pasha, they were known as the three Pashas. Talat Pasha was the one who really put into place the mechanisms for carrying out the Armenian genocide. He was the one, when questioned actually by the U.S. ambassador at the time, why are you doing this? Can't you let, I can understand you feel insecure, but why are you, why don't you at least let the women and children go? And he's like, you think if we left one child alive that they wouldn't come back and haunt us? Right? They say, do you think that child, when he grows up, will ever forgive us? We have to kill everyone. There can't be a single survivor. Right? So it was a complete policy of extermination on his part. He was later, after the war, in fact, after the war, all three of these men were sentenced to death in absentia. They escaped once Turkey and Germany lost World War I. They escaped, but Soghomon Tehlirian, an Armenian living in Germany at the time, saw Talat Pasha in the street in Berlin. And you can imagine what that must have been like, to know that this was the man and who had done this, and now you just see him walking freely in the streets. And he walked up to, he wound up following him and walked up to him and shot him in the head. And then he was arrested by the German authorities, and he was actually set free. He was found not guilty of murder because, as the defense put it, how can you try one man but let a murderer of millions go free? And they eventually let him go, and he then, there's a monument to him in Fresno as well, but he managed to find Talat and execute him. The other two also, Enver wound up dying in battle in the north. So none of them actually survived in the long run, but they did not die in jail, unfortunately. So, but these three are known as the leader, the triumvirate that put together the Armenian genocide. Enver, as I said, because of this pan-Turkic ideology, was really anxious to get into World War I so that they could make territorial gains. And he signed a secret alliance with Germany, and then they entered on the side of Germany in the war. But in his first major excursion eastwards against the Russians, the Turkish troops, the Ottoman troops, were badly defeated at the Battle of Sarıkamış. And I mean, it was horrendous. Several hundred thousand soldiers died. Most of them froze to death on the retreat. They ate all of their horses and had to walk back. It was a terrible, terrible loss. And he was thoroughly humiliated. And on his way back, he formulated the perfect excuse for why he was so badly beaten. And this was because there were traitors amongst the Armenians who showed the Russians where everything was, and who also betrayed the Ottoman troops, because Armenians were fighting at this point in the Ottoman army. And so he blamed on the Armenians, and when he came home, he started putting he talked to Talat, and they started putting into effect what would then be the genocide. And if we look at the chronology, the beginning, already in February, right, Armenians are told to disarm. That is, they had to give up their weapons even the ones serving in the army, they would now only be used for labor battalions, so that they had to schlep the supplies around, the provisions, but they could no longer bear arms. On April 8th, the Armenians of the city of Zeytun were deported from that particular town was always sort of independent and troublesome. So they started with Zeytun, and they tried to they got all the Armenians out of there and marched them to the desert. On April 19th, they started massacres in the region of Van, you'll see in the south, and started killing people in that area. As I said, one of the areas that had a majority of Armenians, so they knew they had to begin there, right? And then on April 24th, approximately 250 Armenian leaders, poets, church leaders, politicians, community leaders, artists were arrested, and then shortly thereafter, nearly all of them were killed. There's some pictures of them. And then by 1916, there were over 1 million dead and 500,000 people displaced. So you can see, as I said, and I'll return to this again, it's very quick. It's very, very fast. Somebody took the census for 1915, the tax census, and it showed that 800,000 Armenians, the Ottoman tax census, showed that 800,000 Armenians had disappeared from the tax rolls, that they could calculate that. So it was quite a quick process. By 1923, the 1.5 million had been killed. As I said, the fighting continued on. There were some, as the war came to an end, there was then the fight for the establishment of the Republic of Turkey, and then more people were killed in the aftermath of that. So, in total, there were 1.5 million, but the majority, the large part of it, had already happened by 1916. Okay. So those are the numbers. That's the historical sort of progression of what happens. But what does this mean, and what does it mean for us? As I said, why do we care? Why are we need to spend time on this? Other people have died. Other people die. Why do we need to be looking at this in particular? And the one thing that I would like to look at today is how the Armenian case is pretty much, is very much inextricably linked with modernity. And I want to look at this in several ways. One is that it establishes a paradigm of genocide, one that becomes all too familiar throughout the 20th century and now into the 21st. And we can see this also by the use of technology, and I'll talk about that. Now, they didn't quite have the technology that we have today, but they did make use of the technology they had. There was also the first instance of massive international relief. I'll talk about that, particularly by the United States. And again, something that we see today is very much a part of us. So this was a formative test case for that. And I also want to look at it as part of the formative years of what we would say the establishment of the contours of the modern Middle East. I know some of you may be in political science. Obviously, the Middle East is an area that attracts a lot of attention by political scientists and by policy people. And I would like to argue that what we see today is as much a result of the Armenian genocide as much as it is of other more recent developments. So let's look at the paradigm of genocide. All right? First, as we see, as normals, Armenians were denigrated. They were not human. Right? They're vermin. They're a disease that need to be eliminated. Right? People who study genocide will be familiar with these sorts of aspersions that are cast on the victim population to make them feel, or to make the other people feel like it's okay to get rid of them. It's not a problem. Don't worry about having any moral qualms. You're not getting rid of human beings. There is a pattern to the extermination. Okay, that this is not a bunch of random killings. Right? The men were gathered, held, and then marched out of town. Usually, they were shot or bayoneted if they wanted to save bullets a short distance from there. And then the elderly, women and children, were told that they would have to leave. And then they were marched through the desert towards Aleppo. And you can see into the desert of places like Deir Zor. You can sort of make it out there on the map, where hundreds of thousands died of heat, exhaustion, starvation, disease. Okay, so this is It is not random, but it's an actually organized and quite a thorough process of elimination. And as I mentioned, simultaneity. Okay? Between April and August 1915, the Armenians of nearly every single major town and village were deported, right? Killed or deported. So, as I said, one of the reasons why genocide is effective is normally because it's quick. The process, they may continue it for a long time, but the hard work, the basis of the killing is done in a very short period of time after the decision has been made to enact the policy. We can see this, that it was not just on the borders, because one of the claims of the of denialists is that look, it was, there was only in areas that were on the border on the front, so we were moving them to save them from the war, right? Because they were in border towns and it was dangerous for them, right? But it didn't just happen on the borders, but in all 6 provinces. And we can see, again, there was a methodical progression in how it was done. We start with the early deportations occurring in Van and Erzurum, places with high population, Armenian populations. And then they had 2 detachments, one going through the south and one going through the north. So again, not random, methodical, organized, planned, efficient, and extensive. And then there were also areas outside both the realm of both the front and even historical Armenia, Trebizond, Ankara, and other cities, right, that were not near the zone of war, where there were also Turkish and Kurdish inhabitants who were not deported for safety reasons. Why are they only deporting the Armenians? So that's, again, we see that this was not just in order to move people away from the front. Technology and organization. As I said, one of the hallmarks of the 20th century has been the development of technology. We all know it. We all appreciate it. But this has also meant that it has also increased the technology we use to kill people. Right? This is the darker side of modernity, right? Where it's now, you don't even have to see the person, right, to kill them. You can do it from a distance. And we see this in rudimentary fashion already present in the Armenian genocide. The telegraph, right? They didn't have email. They didn't have phones. They used the telegraph to communicate those orders. So the person who was organizing this did not have to go and see the Armenians and say, okay, kill them all. He could telegraph that in anywhere throughout the empire. Railway cars, right? New railway lines had been built across the Ottoman Empire with German help during the 19th century in order to increase trade and transport. And now they were being used to move Armenians out of the cities and into the desert. Normally what happened is first that they told you had to evacuate. They made you buy your ticket, right? So you paid for a train ticket, which they then packed full of people. A lot of people died on the way out just from suffocation because they were so packed. Somewhere in the middle of the desert, the train would stop, the people were let out, and they were all shot. And that was it. All right? But this, or you were taken to one of the concentration camps, which is another feature of this. A special organization, that's what it was called. The Takhtilat Masusa was set up, right? Whose sole purpose was to oversee the extermination of the Armenian population. Again, familiar to people who study other genocides, and I'm sure as you'll hear later on as people discuss later genocides, this is again another one of the early case examples of it. And as I said, the gathering in concentration camps, something again familiar from other genocides, but we have it here too. Hundreds of thousands of people packed in areas that were not fit for habitation, where they would die of starvation and or disease. So we see the rudiments of later genocide, what we call the paradigm of genocide, already present here. And these are all things that are made possible, unfortunately, thanks to modernity, right? As well as, I mean, there will be a plus side to this as well, but at this point, these are things that distinguish it in particular from earlier genocides where technology wasn't available at all. Internationalization of the issue, which was very important. Again, this is on the plus side. People knew about it. That's it. Some people say, well, one of the reasons why it happened is because nobody knew what was going on. It was in the middle of the Ottoman Empire. Who knew? No. It was the most talked about event of the day, other than the war itself. People were very familiar with the issue. Right? Starving Armenians, Armenians lived for a long time afterwards to try and get over that term. We don't hear it so much anymore. But starving Armenians was a normal phrase to talk about somebody who's in trouble. Right? That's how Armenians were normally thought of, as starving. As I said, people don't normally think of that today. But if you ask people, 75 years ago, that's what would come to mind. Nearly 200 articles in the New York Times between 1915 and 1922. Okay? The American ambassador to Turkey, you have to remember, America in World War I was neutral, right, up until the end. At the very end, we sided with England and France, but up until then, we were neutral. And so the American ambassador was able to remain in Istanbul while this was going on. And as I said, Henry Morgenthau had these conversations with Talat Pasha, telling him, what's going on here? What are you trying to do? And he wrote these up. Right? And his accounts, as well as those of American missionaries and other consul reports, really enlightened people to what was going on and disturbed them. And it wasn't just in America. Right? In Germany, later on, Franz Werfel wrote The 40 Days of Musadah, which is a historical account of an Armenian community that was fighting for its life. It's fictional. I mean, the events happened, but it's his fictional recreation of it. But this popularized to a great extent and kept the discussion going into the 30s. It was translated into over 30 languages. And they were going to make a movie of it sort of later on in the 30s, but MGM was going to make it. But the State Department said, no, you can't, because it would offend our, at that point now, new Turkish allies. All right, so they squashed it. But not just in America, but in England, in Italy, in France, in Germany, throughout Europe, people were aware of what happened, and they were concerned with what happened. In fact, Germans originally, when they found out what happened, said, we can't let our population know about it. Because if they found out that somebody was trying to exterminate an entire sector of their population, they would revolt at the barbarity. So they kept it hidden. And we know what happens just 30 years later. All right, so, I mean, this is, even though the Germans did find out about it later on, they were, Germans were very much aware of the fact that if the German population found out about this during the war, they would want to break off the alliance with the Ottoman Empire. So they kept it under wraps. Relief efforts, I mentioned this. It was the Armenian Genocide, and in response to the Armenian Genocide, that the American Committee for Relief in the Near East was founded, and that later became the Near Eastern Relief Fund. It's still in existence today, trying to help people in the Middle East. Right? And between 1916 and 1930, the United States alone raised $116 million in relief money, which is the equivalent of $1.5 billion in today's currency. Right? That's still the largest relief effort ever known. And how many people studied this in high school? Good, one person. All right? But this is not Armenian history. This is American history. Something America did right. All right? That is not taught to our own students, our own citizens. Most people had never, I didn't learn about this in high school. All right? I learned about a lot of other things, but not only did I not learn about the Armenian Genocide, or I had a very small, actually very small bit about it in the context of World War I, but I definitely didn't learn about this. All right? And so we're suppressing our own history here for the sake of ulterior motives. I want to talk about that in a little bit. And this was not, also a small affair. This was not just grassroots, but it involved presidents, politicians, celebrities. This was also the first time celebrity. Babe Ruth auctioned off his baseball bat, the one that hit the home run, the most home runs ever. He auctioned it off in support of the Armenians. Right? Again, not something that's commonly known about the Babe. All right? Charlie Chaplin also was involved. I mean, other celebrities. Right? Exactly. Now we're used to George Clooney and others getting involved, but this was a novelty back then. All right? So we see the internationalization of the problem, right, for the first time, and we also see that the world, and in particular the United States, feels like they have a duty to respond in some way, right, and to help. So this is the positive side of modernity. Right? On the one hand, the advances of modernity make something like genocide possible to a degree in which it wasn't before. Right? And on the other hand, it also made this sort of response possible. It was also key for the definition of genocide. As you see, the word genocide did not exist in 1914 or 1915. When you look at the newspaper articles or the headlines, they can't use the terms. It didn't exist. They tried, but you can see them trying to grasp, at what they were dealing with. The total annihilation of a people, the extermination of the people, mass killings. The superlatives, or I would say, how much they could never get it right. They never felt that they could get it right. They keep on adding that it was more and more. Continued, total annihilation, as though you could go beyond total annihilation. But you can see people struggling with it. And it wasn't until 1944 when a Polish Jewish jurist known as Raphael Lemkin, right, based on his own experiences in the Holocaust, where he lost many family members, and his previous study of other crimes against humanity, but growing up also with the memory of knowing about the Armenian genocide, and in direct response to that, coined the term genocide, and then it was accepted. Right, so the Armenian case is formative, not just as an example, but also for the very definition of the term. Right, so it's really one of the key touchstones for genocide studies in that sense. Despite all of this, it also has an impact on the larger Middle East today, okay, when we're looking at it. First of all, the genocide destroyed a vital cultural and economic sector of Anatolia and the Middle East. The Armenians were, as I said, many of them were well off. They were engaged in trade. They were one of the bridges between communities in the Ottoman Empire and between the Ottoman Empire and Europe and Asia. Right? So they had an important role in Ottoman society, in Anatolian society. Right? The genocide ended that and caused what we know today as the Armenian diaspora. Armenians being spread all over the world, right, from Australia all the way up to Canada. Okay, so most of that is directly related to the genocide itself. In some places there were communities before the genocide, but this strengthened the presence of Armenians elsewhere. It also became part of the economic basis for the Republic of Turkey. One of the things, it was not just killing people. They also stole their property, stole their goods, but they did it in a legal manner. This is another aspect of the Armenian genocide that we see repeated. Put it up there, but the legalization of it. That is, the Ottomans were not, it wasn't just that they killed people, they legally justified the taking of the property and the killing of them by passing laws, right, that made what they're doing justifiable. Again, we see this later in other genocides throughout the century. Okay? But what they would do is they would force people, when you went, before you were deported, you would take all of your stuff, put it somewhere, and they kept a list of exactly everything you had. And they told you, oh, when you come back, you can have it back. Then they passed a law saying any unclaimed property now belongs to the state. All right? So when nobody comes back to claim their money in their bank accounts, to claim their possessions from their homes, all of a sudden it devolves on the state, who is then able to redistribute it, right, to other members of the society. And based on that redistribution of not just dinnerware, but factories, large land holdings, right, industries, right, it provides a basis from which the Republic of Turkey can start to build its own middle class. So there is continuity there also between the end of the Ottoman Empire and the genocide and the formation of the Republic of Turkey in 1929. But also, and most disturbingly, this is the beginning of the ethnic cleansing of the Middle East. As I said, the Ottoman Empire was incredibly diverse, but it wasn't just the Ottoman Empire. The entire Middle East was incredibly diverse. It was multilingual, multi-ethnic, multi-religious. Over the course of the past century, we've seen all those ethnic minorities disappear, either by being killed or by voluntary moving. Okay? There used to be Jews throughout the Middle East. Now it's hard to find them outside of Israel. There used to be Christians throughout the Middle East. Again, now it's very difficult to find them. Most of them are in New Jersey. This is something, and it's a process that's continuing to this day, right? And it's gotten to the point where now even Muslims are trying to eradicate each other, to create one sort of monolithic Middle East. And this is a shame, not just for those people involved, but for the Middle East itself, because one of the reasons why it has been such a strong political and economic player throughout world history is precisely because of the tremendous amount of diversity. I know most people, they think, oh, Arab, Muslim, when they think the Middle East. But it is a lot more diverse, even amongst the Arabs themselves, amongst the Muslims themselves, right? But it's always been a lot more diverse than that. Right? People haven't really appreciated when you look at like the films coming out of Egypt, of Cairo in the 1950s. They seem more progressive than anything that has come out of it in the past 20 years. Right? Women had a much greater role in society than they do today. You go to Beirut in the 1950s. An incredible, it made New York look like a two-bit town, right, in terms of what was going on there. And so we've seen the cultural worth of the Middle East also start to decline that goes along with this ethnic cleansing. And it goes back really the first step in this, I would say at the beginning of the process. It's not the only one that's occurring at this time, but one of the first steps that's occurring in this process is the elimination of the Armenian element within the Middle East, bless you, or at least within the Anatolian plateau, right? That sort of is moving in that direction, that we need to make sure our populations are homogeneous and all have the same religion and all have the same language, right? And all the same ethnicity. Right? And this is a mistaken ideology that has only led the region into a much weaker position economically, politically, and culturally. And as I said before, I wanted to briefly, it's still present in the issue of the Nagorno-Karabakh war. Again, I bring this up, when we come back, this is 100 years later, we're still in the midst of a geopolitical crisis, right, as arms build up on both sides. Right? But on the Armenian side, they're willing to fight and die for it so that it'll never happen. Their slogan is never again. They're not going to surrender this time. They will fight back on the one side. On the other side, right, there are claims that they won't come to a resolution on this unless Armenians give up, right, their pursuit of justice and renounce any claim that there was an Armenian genocide. Okay, so this is not just an issue that happened 100 years ago. This is an issue that continues to plague the entire region to this day, right, and is at the center of one of the, as we say it, military hotspots or conflict zones in the 21st century. So, where are we today then? 100 years later, where are we? Well, unfortunately, we're still at the very basic level. That is, of just recognition. I'd like to say that we were at the point of healing, but we're not even there yet. Because most people still have not, or let's say most governments have not officially recognized, right, that this is an issue, that this happened at all. Despite the genocides being well known in the 20s and early 30s, by 1939, Adolf Hitler can say, who today speaks of the Armenians? Right? And when asked about, won't anybody mind if we go in and start killing people? No. History will forget. Right? And he was right. History does forget. It moves on. That's what happened with the Armenians. Time moved on. Some of it was just that simple passage of time. Another world war, Great Depression, another world war, rise of the Soviet Union. Who can be bothered? But there was also a memory loss aided by governmental efforts. A deliberate attempt to forget that it happened. As I said, not only was the Armenian genocide forgotten, but even the efforts, the extraordinary efforts of men like Morgenthau, right, who was a prominent member of American society, were forgotten. Teddy Roosevelt was forgotten. Right? All of that money that was raised, all of those celebrities that really acted for the good, forgotten. As I said, when they tried to make a movie, it was squashed. And it's not just obviously in the United States, it's elsewhere as well, and we'll look at that. The denialist, obviously, the big one is that the Republic of Turkey denies that it happened. This is obviously the major sticking point. For me, as a citizen of the United States, as an American, I'm bothered that the United States hasn't recognized it. But for the Armenians, it's also really, really important that the Republic of Turkey acknowledge the fact that this happened. We can't move to the process, and a lot of people talk, oh, we need to get to reconciliation. Well, it's hard to get to reconciliation if someone doesn't admit they punched you in the face. What am I forgiving them? What am I reconciling? And this becomes an issue because there have been several different tactics. One, they say that it didn't really happen. Thankfully, this one has become harder and harder to uphold. Right? They can't use this argument. But early on, they just said it didn't happen. So they've had to become more refined at it. They said it happened, but it didn't constitute genocide. We were trying to help the people, and they died because it was World War I. It was confusing. Fog of war. Another common, we'll see, another common excuse used in the aftermath by genocide deniers. Fog of war. Anything can happen. Well, many people died in World War I. This one's still going out now. The Republic of Turkey actually issued a statement about that. And I don't know, people know, as I said, April 24th is the commemoration day for the Armenian genocide. The Republic of Turkey decided to make this year, and only this year, because normally it's in March, April 24th, the commemoration of the Battle of Gallipoli. And they invited, I mean, when you talk about a chutzpah, they invited the president of Armenia to partake in this to commemorate the Battle of Gallipoli. And it's staggering, in which they talk about, yes, a lot of people died in World War I. And a lot of people died after World War I because of the flu epidemic. It doesn't change the reality either of the brutality of World War I, right, or of the genocide. Another one is Armenians deserved it, which always is a little bit striking, but they said, well, they were a potential fifth column, and like Talat said, if you don't kill them all, they'll come back and they'll come and get us. In fact, in the city of Van, when I was there, I don't know if it's still there, there's a museum in the city of Van, and one section is devoted to the Armenian genocide. The genocide the Armenians committed against the Turks. And they have a room full of skulls, and they say these are all Turkish skulls that Armenians killed, and that's why they had to be eliminated. Right? It's still, you sort of ask the guy, so if the Armenians committed the genocide, where are they? And they just move you on to the next exhibit. But it's, you do see this, that, oh, well, they deserved it because they were a fifth column, they had contacts with the Russians. Yes, there were some Armenians who did have contact with the Russians. There were some Armenians who fought for the Russian side. But this is an issue that we call collective punishment. Whether every single Armenian man, woman, and child deserved to be executed in the middle of the desert because some people chose to side with the other side, is not considered legally justifiable or morally justifiable. This continuity, I mentioned this, the Republic of Turkey often claims that it has nothing to do with the Ottoman Empire. These sorts of things happened 100 years ago, and the Ottoman Empire has nothing to do with us. Right? We can see denialists put that about, not just in Turkey, but also in American academia. And obviously, to some extent, it's correct. The government of the Republic of Turkey has no responsibility regarding the actions taken by the CUP during World War I or during the Ottoman Empire. However, they are implicit in its denial afterwards for the next 75 years or 80 years. And they're also, as we noted, the Republic of Turkey, part of its financial basis was formed from the money, the wealth that was appropriated from the Armenians. So while one can argue in a court of law about the political responsibility of the current Republic of Turkey, it does have a responsibility to acknowledge what happened under the government of the CUP. And then finally, what's, I guess, most disturbing to me is the postmodernist approach. And again, this is something that's become very popular, not just in Turkey, but also in American academia. That what we're dealing with here is competing narratives. The Armenians have their take on it, and the Turks have their take on it. And we like a free discussion, right? Because we're in a university. So everybody's opinion should be valued, and we should accord the same side equal sort of rights. That's fine, except that the Armenian voice was shut up in 1915, where they weren't able to say anything for themselves. Right? And for the next 100 years afterwards, where it's been systematically denied, pressure has been used by the Turkish lobby, the Turkish government. Pressure has been put on academics by the government to make sure that they don't talk about it. I know academics who signed petitions about the genocide who were denied visas to go into Turkey because of it. They've spent large amounts of money establishing chairs in academic universities throughout the United States, right? As well as publishing their side of the story. So it's not really an equal and fair argument on by any stretch of the imagination. And besides that, right, this is one of the challenges I think that genocide does provide us. Because it's precisely that approach, which, I've used the postmodernist approach to various aspects of historical study, and it can be actually quite fruitful and worthwhile. But there's a limit, and it's recognizing that limit that really is the challenge, I think, to intellectuals today. If someone is holding a gun to your child's head, that is not a competing narrative. If you're starving to death, that is not a competing narrative. If there's someone who has absolute control over your life, your movements, right, and ultimately your death, there is no competing argument. How scholars can move forward, particularly in the field of genocide studies, given the predilection, particularly of historians, towards this postmodernist approach, I think will be one of the challenges for the field as we move forward in the 21st century. On the one hand, being allowed for valid intellectual discussion about the motives, the execution, the ramifications of genocide, and on the other hand, being very sure and being very certain that we are calling genocide genocide and not trying to slip out from the responsibility of what that entails. Thankfully, there have been some progress has been made in the past 100 years. All of these different places have officially recognized it, institutions, including the International Association of Genocide Studies, which is, it's a big, if you're the Association of Genocide Studies and they call you a genocide, it's a genocide, right? I mean, that's pretty much should be taken for granted, right? 20 countries in the Vatican City. Unfortunately, the United States is not one of those countries. Although 42 of the 50 United States have genocide resolutions passed that they accept, that they recognize it. But the country as a whole has not done that for various reasons. Thankfully also, and for me, one of the more positive events has been Turkish scholars who have come forth, and it has not been easy for them. Many of them have been targeted in Turkey. Many of them have seen their offices blown up. Many of them have been imprisoned. Many of them have undergone physical harm because of their willingness to question the official line that no genocide happened. Their willingness to explore and say, what happened, right, to the Turkey we had? And a number of Turks feel that with the Armenian genocide, they lost a major portion of their own history. One thing I didn't mention in that were the number of Armenian women who were actually enslaved in some senses, right? They were married. They were saved because they were married off. Either Turkish men came by and just took them as children. Sometimes there were Bedouin tribes that took them. We don't have exact numbers. But today, more and more people in the Republic of Turkey are saying, yes, I had an Armenian grandmother, but we never talked about it, right? Some of them tattooed their Armenian name on themselves so that they wouldn't forget, right? This is a whole field of inquiry that's waiting, right, to be studied, and whose ramifications are also unknown. How many people in the Republic of Turkey today have Armenian blood in them, quote unquote, is unknown. But there were a number of women who were taken against their will or in order so that they were not killed and married off into these families. Where, however, the memory was preserved, and there were social differences between those people who were the descendants of those women and other members of the society. But thankfully, Turkish scholars, there have been a few brave ones who are starting to re-examine their past. And what are we doing today? I want to talk just very briefly about what we're doing in Fresno and then link it to what I think is a broader picture. We founded the Armenian Genocide Centennial Fresno Committee, and we have a series of activities this year in order to acknowledge what happened, to deal with what happened. It's not easy. What do you do on the 100th anniversary? What's appropriate? Right? What actually does honor to the people who died and to the people who survived? Right? What is permissible? how far can you take this? Well, we decided on three things. One, obviously, this was, in some senses, the easiest aspect of it, was to commemorate. We know we're going to commemorate those who died. To this end, we're building a monument on Fresno State campus that is being built in honor to commemorate those who died during the genocide. And that will be a testament and a witness to what happened for a long time to come. We like the idea of the permanence of it. Right? It's something that will be there in 2016, 2017, 2070, 21. Okay? So that was one aspect of it. But we felt that that wasn't enough. Right? Because commemorating the dead is important, but people have also survived, and they're also part of the story. And so we also wanted to celebrate the achievements of Armenians in the United States and around the world. And to this end, we opened up several art exhibits throughout Fresno, several concerts, including one on April 25th being given by the Fresno Philharmonic, in which a commission piece will be performed, and we'll then go to San Francisco the next day on the 26th. Right? This was a painful decision, and one that provoked a lot of discussion. I mean, how can we celebrate anything? And yet, there's a very strong sense within the community that yes, they tried to get rid of us, but we're still here. And our parents and grandparents fought back, and they survived. And we're here because of them. And so they want to celebrate those achievements, the ability to overcome and inspire others who are going through it today. That it's not the end. Yes, it's painful, it's traumatic, it's destructive. But you can survive, and you can grow afterwards. And then finally, I think the most important part for us then was to educate. Because how do you take what's good for today and move it a generation from now to make sure that people still know, that people still understand what happened? And as I said, I wanted to come back to this idea that, as I said, that genocide, why it's usually effective is because it's so quick. Right? Once the process of genocide has started, there is very little people can do to stop it. This is part of the problem. Right? By the time another nation, country gets its people together, agrees to go abroad to try and stop it, let's say through military means, it takes several months of preparation and work. And as I said, 800,000 people were killed in the first 4 months alone. So even if you had had a rapid response, you would still probably have lost 1 million people. And this is the challenge, obviously. What can we do to prevent further genocides? And the key here, I think, is that you have to prevent them before they start. The minute they start, it's too late. Part of that is by being able to recognize the signs, knowing the paradigm, seeing the signs before, and I'm sure you're learning about that in this class. Right? Making sure that we can see when we're looking outside and inside, wait a second, are we headed on the wrong path here? Right? Is there a way that we can correct this path? And I'm saying this is even more important than taking military action after the fact. Right? Because it's not an easy policy decision. I mean, I sympathize with any leader that has to make a military decision to try and stop genocide. It's not clean, it's not easy, there's no good way to get in and out with minimal casualties to your own people and only get the bad guys. It's very difficult usually. So how can you prevent it before it happens? How can you have people who are alert to this fact before it happens? And this is going to be a long process. This is not going to happen today or tomorrow. It's going to be the challenge of your generation and the generation after you. Because violence, as a means of resolving these historic problems, is really ingrained. It works. History tells us it works. Because you're not punished for it. People will forget. And it's only by making sure that they know that people don't forget and trying to reach out continuously, of being vigilant always, of fighting against that injustice constantly, that we can have any hope of making sure that a genocide won't happen again in the future. Thank you very much. for questions. If anybody has any? Yes? Well, question was, what got me interested in this particular genocide? I come from it from a very, I would say, a different angle than most people. I'm not of Armenian descent, so it wasn't something, even though I'd heard stories about it from my mother, it wasn't something that personally affected me at that point. I originally got interested in Armenian studies because of Second Temple Judaism and early Christianity. That's how I was studying Armenian. Somebody told me to take Armenian because there are great texts preserved in that, which is true. And then I decided from that point that I fell in love with the language, that I would do Armenian studies. And then once you're in Armenian studies, it's inescapable. My own area of research is the 11th to 14th centuries. That's where I do most of my research. But you realize very quickly that you're working on the backs of the people who died or survived this event. As much as you may want to insulate yourself from it because it's uncomfortable, it's not, it's not an easy one to have to come to terms with, particularly if it's not your field of study. It's everywhere. And also growing up, having seen what was happening in Rwanda, what's happening in Darfur, and realizing that I also deal with a community to which this had happened in the past, and which you can see the parallels, but very few people draw attention to them. My wife, whom I married, is of Armenian descent, and that did then add a personal aspect to it, that my own daughter and son, that I had to explain to them what happened to their great-grandparents. And I remember my daughter just asking me and say, why would anybody want to do that? And I didn't have an answer. There is no good answer. All you can say is you hope, that you make sure and you do anything possible that people won't do it again. The mind of the perpetrator, unfortunately, sometimes is more interesting than the mind of the victim. And it's one thing I tried to avoid, and even though I do have a couple of pictures of the victims in here. We very quickly get into a sort of voyeuristic position when it comes to genocides. I mean, we're horrified at them, but we too look and objectify these people who have been killed, or they've been starved to death, or they've been racked by disease. And that was clearly the case in even in the early 20th century. People heard these reports, and they, there was a horror, but there's also an attraction to the horror. But what also got me into it was trying to figure out why do people want to, how does this happen? How do people that you normally would never consider doing this, and Armenians do say that, like, it was people that they grew up with, suddenly turn. That wasn't always the case. In many cases, there were people they didn't know. There were also many cases that have to be recognized in which their neighbors whom they did grow up with saved them. And that's the reason why they went out, that they were able to get out. But I think it was that question as well, is why would somebody do this? And trying to understand that, because I think it isn't, I think all too often it's easy they're crazy, they're psychopaths, they're madmen, it's barbaric. We distance ourselves from it. But it's actually a part of each and every one of us. Obviously, everybody in humanity has the capability to do this, given the right set of circumstances. The question is, how do we check ourselves before we get there? What sort of processes can we put into place? And on the one hand, it just makes it a lot easier to demonize the people who did the killings. But I think it's absolutely important that we realize that each and every one of us could have been on the other side of that as well. Not just the victim, but also the perpetrator, and thereby try to be aware of how we treat other people, and just on a very basic level. I'm sorry, is there a moderator in the back there? Sure. Some of them wound up coming to the United States. They said that there was a genocide, the population was wiped out, they were harassed in Turkey, they got jobs in America. And they're fine here, though, I mean, fine in the sense of they're still, in some senses, hated in their home, which is difficult for them on a different level. Some of them were imprisoned there in Turkey. People who published books on the genocide, their offices were blown up. And one of the most famous examples, you think of is Orhan Pamuk, an author, famous Turkish author, who in an interview happened to say casually, I mean, wasn't trying to, I don't think he was even trying to make a point. They were talking about something about like having problems with your history, and they said, yeah, you know, we have problems with our history, such as the elimination of 1 million Armenians. People in Turkey were told to send their copies of his books back to the publisher. Schools took them out of the libraries, and truckloads of the books were sent back. And this is of like one of the most famous people the Republic of Turkey has produced, for world literature. So there were, nobody has been, as far as I know, nobody has been executed or something like that. People have spent some jail time, but I think most of them have been released after, because they still have, there's a law in Turkey that you can't defame the fatherland. That is, if you speak anything against the fatherland, you're arrested. Now, what normally happens is that they arrest you, they put you on trial, but you don't do any jail time. But still, the law exists. I think right now there are more. Turkey has imprisoned this past year more journalists than it has. I forget how many in a long time, but they've arrested over 100 journalists, I think, in the past year and put them in prison for this sort of activity. That side of the things is not moving in a good direction, I have to say, coming from the top. On the bottom, however, you do see a greater acknowledgement by people. Even if they're not being active about it, you can go around and people say, yeah, it happened, in a way that you wouldn't have 40 years ago. And as I said, especially this discovery of people having Armenian blood in them, or that they had an Armenian ancestor or grandparent, I think is really woken a lot of people up. How far this will go, whether the state will be able to repress it completely, whether we're on the path towards recognition and an opening up of the Republic of Turkey, I have no idea. It's complicated. I mean, it's further complicated. Like, for example, in Diyarbakir, they're actually great, which is a Kurdish city. It's mainly Kurdish, right? And the mayor there, says, I'm a friend of the Armenians. They rebuilt an Armenian church. They have ceremony, and they're celebrating liturgies there. They're bringing Armenians in. He's like, I want Armenians to come back to their hometown. He's totally great, but that's one mayor in one place. And it's a very different part. As you know, Turkey also has a problem with its Kurdish population. And so how the Kurds are using this issue for their own advantage or out of genuine goodwill, it's a complex issue on both sides. And where the Republic of Turkey will be going in the next 20 to 50 years, I honestly can't say. I mean, for all of us, I hope it's going towards, greater openness, greater freedom of the press, greater recognition of its own history, and greater dialogue with the former Ottoman, minorities of the empire, including the Armenians first and foremost. But whether it will or not, it's not up to me, and I don't really know. Down here. Okay, this is again, it's a complex issue. First and foremost, Turkey is a NATO ally. We have a radar base on Mount Ararat, the Armenian mountain. I mean, they call it Armenian. It's a mountain. Armenians are very fond of it. On one side of it, there's a NATO radar base that was used for spying on the Soviet Union. Obviously, the Republic of Turkey, if it allows us to use its air bases, has a very strategic position from which we can try and monitor things in the rest of the Middle East. Having said that, they have not been cooperative, particularly given that they are a NATO ally, in allowing us to use those bases. The Turkish government has a very strong lobby, and they pay lots of members of Congress benefits and other sorts of incentives not to accede to it. And I think the other issue is, what's the plus side? If you're looking at it from the US government, what's the plus side? We admit it. We annoy an ally. Possibly they'll cut off relations, which they did, for example, when France did acknowledge it. And they cut off relations for 6 months. But, you know, what is the US going to gain? And I think that's the very sort of cynical way they look at it. They say that it's not a matter, you know, the US government, a common line is the US government is not in the habit of proclaiming historical truths, which is true. I don't think the government should be going out there saying, this happened in 1401, this happened in 1410, this happened in 1915. On the other hand, it's because it's denied as a historical truth that it actually has to do it. Right? There's a real reason why they have to come out and acknowledge that it happened. It's because it's being actively denied. If they didn't deny it, I wouldn't see any reason for the US to have to officially recognize it. But since there is a persistence in this denial that actually has greater ramifications worldwide, it's imperative, I think, on a moral basis that we do recognize it. But they tend to be geopolitical, not to mention that there's oil that goes from the Caspian Sea on a pipeline through Georgia, purposely skirts Armenia. It's quicker to build it through Armenia, but they didn't want to do that, so it goes around Armenia and then into Turkey and out. So, I mean, there are a variety of economic and political reasons why the United States does not see any sort of, you know, plus side to acknowledging it, unfortunately. Yes? Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that's a very good point. Yeah, he invited him on April 24th, not for the genocide though, but for Gallipoli, right? So the question was, what is the current state of relations between the Republic of Turkey and the Republic of Armenia, as well as between the peoples? Not good. I mean, that's that's the short answer. The Republic of and there were motions. They were called the protocols. Several years ago, put into place to try and normalize relations between the two. But part of that decision, part of that agreement would be that Armenians would, or the Republic of Armenia would, relinquish any claim to Nagorno-Karabakh. Right, the Armenians would relinquish anything having to do with Nagorno-Karabakh, and that they would leave the genocide up to a panel of historical scholars, but there would be no political sort of dimension to it. The Republic of Armenia has stated and has repeatedly stated that it's willing to have open borders with the Republic of Turkey without preconditions at any time. Okay? That means the Republic of Armenia does not require the Republic of Turkey to recognize the genocide to normalize relations. However, the reverse has not been true. One of the reasons why the protocols failed, however, goes back to the second part of your question, is that the diaspora, also in America and in France in particular, fairly clearly stated that you have no right. That means the Republic of Armenia has no right to actually decide on whether or how the question of the Armenian genocide is recognized. Because it's something that all Armenians share, and all Armenians have a say in it, not just the Republic of Armenia. And likewise, nobody is in favor of giving up on Nagorno-Karabakh, either within the Republic of Armenia itself, the population, or outside in the diaspora. So this has led to loggerheads. The Republic of Armenia is in a very tough economic situation. It doesn't have many natural resources. It is blockaded pretty much on three sides. God bless you. Iran and Russia are its two best allies in the region. You're knowing you're in a bad position when Iran and Russia are your two best allies. That's not the position you want to be in. But the Iranians sent fuel when nobody else did. Right? And that was a huge deal. The Russians also agreed, put troops on the line when Turkey pretty much was amassing troops on the Armenian border, right? And said, if you touch Armenia, we'll wipe you out. So, they have good relations with those two countries. They were also spared what happened. Actually, the only way they got out of the energy crisis was saying, we're going to start up our nuclear reactor again. And we'll turn the entire region into a Chernobyl. And very quickly, France ran over and they rebuilt the reactor, and they made sure it was according to, it's on a fault. Armenia, there are earthquakes there all the time. You don't want your nuclear reactor running if you can help it. But they reinforced it, they rebuilt it, and it now runs. But without that, people who were there when the reactor was shut down in 92, 93, they were burning their parquet floors. They burnt their libraries to try and... I had a friend of mine who was there who didn't shower for like 5 months because it was just too cold. He never got out of his clothes. He used his refrigerator as a bookshelf and just left the food out because there was just no heat. So, that sort of situation is, again, another ramification of the process of trying to eliminate the Armenian people. And again, it did not succeed. But there are a lot of political tensions. There are a lot of personal tensions, particularly between members of the diaspora and the government of Turkey. Although I have also known many personal friendships. And this is the added, I would say, unfortunate part of this, is that actually when you get Armenians and Turks together and they're talking, they share a common cultural heritage, despite differences, linguistic differences and religious differences. They did inhabit a common world for a long period of time. And, they get along really well on an individual basis a lot of the time. But it can't surmount this historical injustice that hasn't been recognized. And that just turns, what is already a tragic historical event, also, I think, into more, day-to-day personal sadness in terms of having these two cultures that, I'm not going to say the Armenians were like, obviously there was discrimination in the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't like a paradise, but nonetheless there was, there was a cultural vitality there, and there was an engagement with each other, and that's gone to a large extent, and that's I think that's culturally that's just a very sad state of affairs. So I hope I answered your question. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it did. We know, maybe, not that they were like carbon copying it, but I think Hitler was definitely inspired by that you could get away with it, nobody would care. And we know that there were some people who operated concentration camps that had also served as advisors to Turkey during World War I. Right? They began their German military career in World War I. And they saw the genocide happen. And they were advising Turkey on other matters, but while they were advising them, this was also going on. And later on, they became high-ranking members within, or not high-ranking members, but they became very, they had positions in the Nazi regime and concentration camps. So I'm not going to say that they did a one-to-one sort of correspondence where they looked at it and they mapped it out. Obviously, things had changed in the past 30 years, but I think it was there for a lot of them in the background. This is something you can do, and this is something you can get away with, and no one's going to bother. And they were right. No one did. The United States let 500,000 Hungarian Jews die because they didn't want to waste the bombs. And so, we also, took in hundreds of thousands of Jews. So it's always a, part of the sad part is the genocide gamble has historically worked. Because by the time anyone gets around to it, it's too late. It's already over. It's done. So even if you have to pay punishment for it, you're still rid of, those people are still done. So this is what I'm saying. You got to get to it before it happens, because once it happens, there's no plus side to stopping in that sense, if you're already on that mindset. I'm sorry, yeah. Sure. The Hamidian massacres. The question is, why aren't the 100 to 200,000 Armenians who were killed under Sultan Abdul Hamid II in 1895-96 included in the official tally of the victims? I would say a couple of reasons. One, the governments were different. Right? So in the first instance, it was Sultan Abdul Hamid II who was overseeing this. In the second instance, it was the Committee of Union and Progress. So I think there's a reason to separate them. The motivations were different. I mean, Sultan Abdul Hamid was not trying to eliminate all the Armenians. He still saw them as taxpayers that were financing his own, personal wealth in some ways, right? He wanted to teach them a lesson, make sure that they understood what their place was, but he didn't want to eliminate them. So I think the psychology was different. The idea of Turkey for Turks, I don't think would have made sense to him. In that sense, he was still a sultan, and everybody was his subject, and he could do with them as he wished. Those are, I would say, the two major reasons I would say that we have to distinguish. Although, I mean, obviously, if you're dead, it doesn't make a difference to you. But I think when we're studying the events, we need to distinguish between the phenomena, and not that one is better or worse than the other, but that they operate differently. Whether, yeah. I think, in some ways you can see that, but as I said, in 1908, the coup of 1908 didn't eliminate, but they thought it did. It didn't eliminate the ethnic tensions that were there. But people were like, well, that was Sultan Abdul Hamid II, and he was crazy, and nobody liked him. Yes, from the position today, we can see how in some ways it was a signal. It was a first eruption. It was, sort of a symptom. But if you were standing in 1908, even then in 1909 in Adana, another 30,000 Armenians were killed in ethnic violence, right? 30 to 40,000, again, in about a month. In June 1909. And the reaction on both sides, I mean, the Ottoman government then, which was the constitutional government, came in and they arrested who they said were the ringleaders. They executed them, and they said it's over. These are just people who were hung over from the days of the sultans. And again, they didn't see it as indicative of a much greater problem that was going on in this part of the empire. Yes, in hindsight, you can see it, but when you're there on the ground, it was much more complicated. And people, for better or for worse, hoped for the best, that this was going on in a positive direction, not in a negative direction. Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is to bring it back to what's going on in Diyarbakir, and will this have any sort of effect on reconciliation? As I said, Diyarbakir is actually a complex situation because it's a Kurdish city with a Kurdish mayor. And he's been very forthright and very positive and very warm towards Armenians and welcoming. But why? I mean, I don't want to doubt his sincerity, but there are also political considerations regarding the Kurds and their struggle against the Republic of Turkey for their own recognition and their own statehood. And one doesn't cancel the other. He may feel like this is a good way to sort of leverage pressure on the Republic of Turkey, and he may also feel like, it's great, I love these people, I have no problem, I want them back. If we have a Kurdistan, they can come back or whatever. I mean, I don't know what he's thinking, but that has very little to do with what's going on in Ankara, right? And that's where we have to start to look, hopefully. I want to get people who haven't asked a question before. Yeah. Excellent question. The question was, I said in 1913 that the Turks disbanded, ordered the Armenians to be disarmed. And why did the Armenians let it happen? And did they try to fight back? Great question, and it's a very complex answer. In fact, Armenians had just been granted the right to bear arms in 1908. They were not allowed previously to, to bear arms, although they did participate in some of the wars. Having said that, there was a restriction against them. Many of them, nonetheless, did have arms for hunting. I mean, especially in the eastern provinces, did have arms for hunting. Did have, so what we consider, local firearms for their own personal use. And some of them did resist the call for disarmament. In the army, it was a little bit difficult because obviously, if 5 people surround you and say, "Give me your gun," and that's it. There's not much you can do. And they were hoping it would be a temporary measure. In the provinces themselves, though, there were people who said, "Wait a second, we're not giving this up. This is the only thing that's standing between us and death." And so they did form groups, they're known as the Fedain, that went off and tried to fight back. They fought in the province of Van, as I said, when those first massacres happened. They fought throughout the First World War. Some of them did go over to the side of Russia to help fight with them and form their own sort of units. The most famous one of these is General Antranik, who had earlier fought for the Ottoman Empire in earlier wars in the Balkans, and then realized what was going on and decided to form his own fighting force to defend Armenians. He died in Fresno at the end of his life. So there was an attempt to do it. The organization was problematic, and again, the speed with which the genocide occurred meant that I don't think the resistance was as effective as it could have been. Again, the Ottoman side of it, the CUP side of it, had the entire state on its side in terms of they were able to use the railway lines, they were able to use the telegraph. They were able to make this legal, right, so that it can incentivize other people to partake. And so it depended. And they struck at the most heavily populated Armenian areas first. So then in other areas where they were minorities, in some places they were just outnumbered. And other places, once they were already in the military and dispersed throughout the empire, the men of fighting age were already dispersed to the various front lines. It was much easier to then pick off the people who were left behind. Likewise, on April 24th, it's not by accident that they picked these people at the very beginning, right? The people who were able to communicate to everyone. Politicians, community leaders, religious leaders. Thousands of priests were also killed during this. Churches and monasteries were burnt down. Right? Poets, newspapermen, right? Anybody who could communicate, right? Or anybody who could organize Armenians, tell them what's going on. Right? They were eliminated first. And so once you cut the head off, then it's just a matter of cleaning up. And so there was an attempt at resistance, but it was not successful. They did manage in one area after the war to carve out a little around the Cilician coast there, Musadag, the mountains what today is where Turkey meets Syria. But that was with French help, and after the war, basically the European powers also abandoned any of these Armenian resistance groups and said, "I'm sorry, we're tired of fighting. We got to go." And then basically the whole movement fell apart after that. Or the who? Okay, so how informed and knowledgeable are Turks today of the Armenian genocide? Not at all. It is not taught at all. I can speak, some things have gotten better. It used to be, there's a beautiful Armenian monastery on the island of Akhtamar that has been also, they've restored it because it's a nice tourist site as well. But it was never, recently it's now labeled Armenian, but it was not labeled Armenian. Anything Armenian was not labeled. I was in Istanbul, and I remember I went to the tourist information board because I wanted to go to the Armenian Patriarchate. There is still a small Armenian population in the Republic of Turkey. It's about 50,000 people in the Republic of Turkey today. They have a patriarch in Istanbul. And I wanted to go and go to service there and to see him because I knew him. And I went to the Tourist Information Board and I said, how do I get to the Armenian Patriarch? He said, I don't know. And I said, okay, how do I get to this street? I don't know. I said, how do you get to this section of town? I don't know. And I said, just point me in the general direction, okay, since you're a Tourist Information Board. And he did. He pointed me in the general direction, and nobody knew along the way where this place was until somebody who was a deaf mute, I think, came up to us. I was walking with my wife, and he said, this, are you Christian? You know, just by pointing, he made the sign of the cross. And we said, yes. And he said, follow me. And he motioned to us, and then he showed us where it was. So it was that level. There was, I remember flying on Turkish Airways, and there was a whole section, a center spread on the town of Ahlat, a town which I knew very well from my studies of the 14th century, where there was a large Armenian population. Armenians had been in control of the city. There were lots of fun things that happened around there. Things started, the article started with the Sumerians and went down to the present day and didn't once mention Armenians. Right? That's an official airline. That's the official. So, you know, when they interview students, they just say, no, it didn't happen. This is just made up by Armenian agitators. You know, so it's not in the schools there. That's what I'm saying. When these Turkish scholars actually turn to their own history and have to overcome that, it's quite a big. It's not easy for them at all. And you know, I don't want to make it seem like, oh, well, they're just realizing the truth, because it's you know, basically everything you've been brought up to believe, then you think has been a lie. And it erodes the very foundation of your trust in the system that brought you up and that you thought had done a good job. So it is a difficult thing for them, because they aren't taught this. It's either ignored or it's actively denied, you know, very forcefully. Yes. Oh, the question is whether the size of Armenia today was constructed on purpose. Yes and no. It wasn't constructed by Turkey. As I said, after the war, after World War I, the Armenians did have plans, and supposedly President Wilson was going to support the creation of this large Armenia that incorporated parts of what we said was the 1/10 historical Armenia, which I must say was not a political state. It was an area where Armenians were culturally and linguistically dominant. But in any case, something larger than what we now have today as Armenia. Basically, what the borders today reflect is where the Armenians were able to hold off Turkish nationalist troops at the creation of the state of Turkey. I mean, Turkey takes time for the republic to be founded, but basically where Armenian troops were able to stop Turkish forces from going any further. It then happened that it was incorporated within the Soviet Union, which was being formed, or at least in the early stages of after the Russian Revolution. There were big fights in Armenia itself between those people who were nationalists and those people who were communist. But eventually it was absorbed into the Soviet Union and made a Soviet republic. And what today is the country is basically, when the Soviet Union fell apart, that republic, that Soviet republic, is now the Republic of Armenia. So it's the third republic. So it's on purpose in the sense that that border, at least the western border, was fought for. The other border was sort of agreed upon by the Soviet Union, but it wasn't purposely put into place, let's say, to embarrass them as much as that's thankfully for them where they were able to stop Turkish troops.
Sergio, thank you very much.
Thank you.